Hello and welcome to this video all about how I score games when I do a review. The reason I want to do this video is because I kind of feel like scoring is a very inherently flawed way of ranking a game. And the reason for that is because everybody's scores mean a different thing. Like, somebody's 10 out of 10 could mean something completely different to my 10 out of 10, for example. So I just thought I would go through and sort of casually discuss what my process is for when I'm ranking a game like that. I have actually considered stopping doing the something out of 10 scoring system before, because it's flawed for not only the reason that I just mentioned, but also I feel like the score that you give a game could change and adapt over time depending on how a game ages. Like, if it ages bad, the score would potentially go down a bit, but if it ages well, it could go up. Alternatively, you might just look back at a video and just think to yourself that the score just absolutely isn't accurate based on what you know about the game. A situation where that has happened to me is that I actually gave the original Resident Evil a 5 out of 10, and while I had good reasons to do that, I just think a 5 out of 10 is a little bit too low. If I could go back and change that score, I'd probably give it a 6 out of 10. So that's another reason why the scoring out of 10 system isn't particularly good, because you can't go back and change it. Another reason that I don't particularly like this scoring method is because a game can be more complicated than that, and just assigning it a number kind of just simplifies the whole process you went through in the review. And just by giving it a number, it can be seen as being a little bit too, like, standard, I guess, like you're just using a stock, like, review template, I guess. Like, there can be aspects of a game that you really enjoyed that would make it a 10 out of 10, but then if there's a few things you didn't enjoy, you've kind of got to bring the score down, but because of how much you enjoyed it, you might not want to do that. So it's about getting that balance right, and I feel like scores can be a little bit inaccurate, so I would say I tend to not really pay too much attention to the score of a game. But at the same time, I do feel like it's an overall good reflection of a game's quality, which is why I still do it and why I intend on keeping doing it in future videos. So I suppose the best way of actually getting on with this video is to go through my review scale, starting at 1 and ending at 10, and basically just go through the gist of what that would mean if I assigned a game to that score. 1 out of 10 would basically be disgustingly bad and you should avoid it at all costs, and there's hardly anything positive to say about it in the slightest. 2 out of 10 is awful, but there's some kind of small redeeming feature about it where if you squint there would be some positive aspect. Maybe it has an idea that's slightly interesting but poorly executed, or something like that. 3 out of 10 is very bad, but there's an aspect of it that's actually fairly well implemented, that's interesting or genuinely good. It's just everything else around the game that brings it down to a 3. 4 is bad, but it does interesting things throughout the entire game and is reasonably well put together. 5 out of 10 is average. This is kind of where the mediocre games go, games that don't really do anything all too special, but then aren't particularly bad either. It's just the run-of-the-mill average games. 6 out of 10 is good. It has a lot of aspects that are enjoyable, and it's a good game overall, but it has some serious flaws that do impact the overall experience of the game. 7 out of 10 is great. These are games that could potentially keep you coming back to play them just because of how fun they are, and this is the sort of game where you would be able to look past its flaws if you were really into its positives. But you would still have to acknowledge that it does have flaws. 8 out of 10 is amazing. These are games that are really well produced and maybe only have a few small issues. However, all of the core mechanics and gameplay in these games are very good, resulting in 8 out of 10s being Game of the Year potential. 9 out of 10 is absolutely incredible. These are games that nail almost every single part of what they set out to achieve. Maybe there's 1 or 2 nitpicks here and there that you could point out, but other than that, these games are almost perfect. 9 out of 10 would be Game of the Generation material. And now we move on to the big one, 10 out of 10. This is a score that I only assign to games that I consider to be absolute masterpieces. games where there are no negatives, or maybe one very, very slight negative, because, I mean, can a game really be utterly perfect? I don't know if that's possible. At the time of recording this video, I've only ever given one game a 10 out of 10 in my video reviews, and that game is PT. That's a game where I consider it to have absolutely achieved every single thing it set out to do, and not only achieved it, but done it in such a way that it completely resonates with me, and I feel like there's practically nothing bad to say about the game. Needless to say, not many games are capable of achieving 10 out of 10 in my opinion. But yeah, that's my review scale, hopefully that makes sense. So something interesting to point out here with the way that I score games personally is that just because I give a game a higher score doesn't necessarily mean that I prefer that game over a game that I've given a lower score. This is because when I review games, I'm trying to judge them in a relatively unbiased way. I'm fully aware that that's impossible because everybody has individual tastes that are going to affect the positives that they see and how much the negatives affect them. But at the same time, I think I'm pretty good at sort of disconnecting myself from personal experiences and seeing the game for what it is. So no matter how much I do enjoy a game, I think I'm pretty good at focusing on the flaws as well as the positives that I might not have seen before when I come to review it with a critical eye. But what that means is that I could review a game and see loads of flaws that I've never really noticed before in a game that I really enjoy, which is obviously going to negatively impact its score, but that doesn't necessarily impact my enjoyment of the game. Hopefully that makes sense. It's a little bit difficult to explain, but I feel like if you really like a game's characters, if you really like a game's world or gameplay elements, you might prefer that even over a game that's considered to be really, really good with a higher score. But yeah, hopefully that clarifies that, because I feel like if I was to give a game a 6 out of 10, I wouldn't want people to think that I absolutely hate the game. Like I said when I was going through how I score games, a 6 out of 10 is a good game, so I wouldn't want people to think otherwise. I guess that's why the actual review portion of the videos that I make is a lot more important than the overall score I give it, because the review is much more likely to reflect how I actually feel about the game than the score. Another thing to point out is that because my channel has a focus on retro games, I do actually take into consideration how old a game is when I'm giving it a score. So what that does mean is that technically a score that I give to, for example, an NES game isn't the same score that I would give to a modern game, which makes it a little bit complicated, I guess. But let me explain why I do that. So, for example, if I was reviewing an NES game, I would be taking into consideration the fact that there's going to be quality of life improvements that have been made in modern games, and just like improvements to user interfaces, improvements in general technology, like the ability to save, that just weren't possible on the NES games. So I don't necessarily think it's fair to judge an NES game and mark it down because, for example, you can't save the game, or if there's not as much content as there would be in a modern game, and that sort of thing. I feel like when you're judging a retro game, you do have to consider the fact that it was made quite a long time ago, and sort of compare it to other games coming out at the time to get a feel for what the quality of games were like back then. So when I gave a 9 out of 10 to the original Bionic Commando on NES, I still stand by that, but I guess you could argue that that 9 out of 10 isn't the same 9 out of 10 that I would give to a modern game. However, what I will say is that that's not an excuse for straight up bad design in these retro games. A lot of retro games do have elements of really bad design, and despite them not knowing better, I feel like even if you were playing it back then, you would have been able to have identified elements of this bad design. So I do take that into consideration. That isn't a free pass for all of these retro games. But yeah, that about wraps up my video on how I score games and what those scores actually mean. Hopefully that was somewhat interesting to watch and clarifies some of the scores that I've given to games in the past. Looking back on some of the scores that I've given in some of my older videos especially, I do somewhat disagree with some of them, but for the vast majority of the videos that I've done where I've given them a score, I do still agree with them, so I guess that's good. But it does just go to show how the scoring system is inherently flawed and you shouldn't really pay too much attention to it. It can give you a good overview of a game's quality, but if you want to get like the full opinion, you really do need to watch or read the full reviews before making your mind up if the game is for you or not. But yeah, hopefully you've enjoyed watching this slightly rambly video. Let me know in the comments if you think my review system is bad or good. What do you think I could do to change it if you don't like it? But yeah, until next time, bye!